you forget. So there'll be something going on here, but just not this next week. A little bit of review again. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can see kind of where we've been so far. Beginning in the garden, talking about the patriarchs and the promises that were made there, about the promises to David in a kingdom, the Psalms, and then we have last been in the prophets, major prophets, and this last time in the minor prophets, all observing the language that they use, the themes that are present, this stuff that gives us good content and background as we move into the New Testament. So that hopefully, as we're reading and observing, when we see certain things, we go, oh, that's familiar. I saw that somewhere. And you've got an idea that there's these connections between the Testaments. Okay, so today we're going to go to the New Testament, and we're going to begin with Jesus' Olivet Discourse. This is a big one. So Jesus gave some major sermons. You think of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, this is a major sermon that he gives during the last week of his life in ministry on the earth. You find this in Matthew 24 and 25, really. But you also find it in Mark 13, Luke 21. Matthew's version of this is longer, more extensive. They fairly well parallel each other. Matthew's version adds some of Jesus' parables at the end of it that go with the message, okay? Whereas Mark and Luke don't do that. But for the most part, they run pretty parallel to one another with just a few exceptions. And we'll note some of those as we go along. This is, again, during the last week of Jesus' life, during the Passion Week. The location is he's on the Mount of Olives, looking over the Kidron Valley, looking at Jerusalem. And he's responding to a question that the disciples posed to him, is really the context of the whole sermon. He's responding to something they have asked him. And really the interpretive challenges as we get into it, in regards to the what and the when, you might say. What is Jesus describing as we move through the sermon, and when are we talking about? So those are the interpretive challenges, and that might sound oversimplified for the moment, but we're going to walk through it very carefully, and you'll begin to understand the what and the when and how these are the challenges of what Jesus is doing in this sermon. You have three interpretive frameworks, I guess, that exist historically as people have looked at this. There is, and these are just the labels that are used. There is the futurist view of the Olivet Discourse, which sees all of that Jesus is saying is referring to his second coming. Like it's all looking forward to the parousia, the coming of Jesus. The preterist comes from a word from Latin that just simply means past, okay, before. And that's a view that everything that Jesus is saying in the Olivet Discourse is already happened. It's all about the destruction of the temple and the judgment there that happened in AD 70. And then you have this preterist futurist view where Jesus' words, part of them do address things that have already happened. Now, they hadn't happened at the time he was saying it. They were future then. But for us, they've already happened. And there are things he's speaking to that are still future even for us. Okay, so you kind of have those three camps. Probably it's that last one you're most familiar with hearing, I would think. I think that is typically the most common one that you run into, and I think is the correct one as well. But even within that one, there's great discussion on about when does Jesus move from one topic to another? When does that shift occur in that sermon, if there is that shift at all. So we're going to kind of work through all that, and hopefully as we do that, you'll see kind of how that unfolds and how the different interpretations do come in. So let's begin at the beginning here. First two verses. Jesus left the temple and was going away when the disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all of these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." I'm going to give you Mark's version. Mark says, "And he came out of the temple. One of the disciples said to him, 'Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings.' And Jesus said to him, 'Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" And then Luke. "And while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, 'As for these that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" All right. So this is the provocative statement that Jesus makes as they are in the temple area. We know that Jesus was coming into the temple during the day. He was leaving during the evening all that week, right? And doing different things. Here, the opportunity is now, it's prophetic. Jesus is going to go into the role of prophet. And he says this very provocative thing about the temple. Not just that it's going to be burned or destroyed, but not one stone will be left on top of the other. Which would have been mind-blowing because of how massive these stones were. You can go to Josephus and you can read about just how huge these stones were. 60 feet long, 80 feet long, and how they the craftsmen had put them together almost in a seamless way. When you would have looked at this temple, it would have almost seemed impossible that what Jesus was saying could actually be done because of what this thing looked like. And so the disciples are naturally going to have a response to this. This is an incredible statement that Jesus is making. Okay? So don't forget the context, right? We always say context is king, right? That's so important. So don't forget verses 1 and 2, that this is what prompts the whole discourse, okay, is what Jesus says here that is going to happen to the temple. All right, so we go into verse 3, we get the question. So they leave, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Okay? And again, I'm not going to do this for everything, but at the beginning, I do want to give you Mark and Luke's versions as well. In Mark's version, we read, "And he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?'" And then Luke, "And they asked him, 'Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?'" Now clearly, Matthew's version, Mark's version clearly has a two-part question. When will these things be, and when will be the coming of the end of the age? Luke doesn't exactly have that, but yet if you read on, and even in Luke's version as it parallels Matthew and Mark, it's clear that Jesus does shift into the parousia and talk about the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds, and so the same content is there. So basically you have the disciples asking a twofold question, right? When will these things be? Now what is he referring to when they ask that first part of the question? Well, what has Jesus just said? Right? The temple, all these stones, not one will be left on top. So when will this thing happen? That's the first question. And then the second question, and then what will be the signs of your coming? Which is interesting.
They learned that when a prophetic statement had been made, when something was about to fulfill, something usually happens before that is an overshadowing of that, a pre.
type.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do run into that.
They say it's getting near, you better wake up.
Yep, yeah, he's going to say a lot about that. So this question has, where Jesus' statement has now provoked these questions, and now Jesus, the rest of this is him responding to that. Does that make sense? Okay, so keep that in context. So we go on to verses 6, I should say 4, right? 4 through 7. And he begins. Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars, rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places." So Jesus is talking about signs, things that his disciples will be able to observe that will go before the destruction of the temple. Okay? So notice these things. We know a lot about these things that did happen between when Jesus said these words and the destruction of the temple 40 years later. Okay? We know from history that the things that Jesus said to be on the lookout for did happen, right? There were false messiahs that came after Jesus was off the scene. They're mentioned in Acts. I think I've got those up here. Let's see. Yeah, they're mentioned in the book of Acts. You have this Theudas and Judas the Galilean who are mentioned, and the Egyptian is mentioned as well. Josephus. Now you're going to keep hearing the word Josephus. If you study this time period, Josephus is really important. He's really helpful to our study of the Bible because he's writing about the same time period. And he's a Jewish historian, so he is particularly interested in all things Jewish, right? So he gives us a lot of records about what happens during this time. And interesting enough, these mentioned in the book of Acts, Josephus also mentions them, and he mentions other ones too. Not just these guys, but even some others. So we know that there were these false prophets, false messiahs that came along. We know that there was great political turmoil in Rome leading up to AD 70, especially during the time of Nero, because he was a nut. And there was all kinds of political turmoil. People tried to assassinate him. Then the whole Senate moved to remove him, and he eventually is arrested and found guilty, and he commits suicide before they can execute him. And then after that, there's like 4 different guys claiming all to be the rightful emperor, and it's chaos. It's political turmoil. Okay, so you have a lot of those things happening. We know about famines, and we know about earthquakes. The famine that we read about in the book of Acts that was so impactful. We know from historians of the time the major earthquakes in the region in 60 and 62 and 64. All these things Jesus is mentioning, we know from history that these things happened, right? So we're not surprised. And he's telling his disciples, be paying attention to these things. And then he goes on to verse 8. All these things, the false messiahs, the wars and rumors of wars, the earthquakes, the famines, etc., all these are but the beginning of birth pains. All right. So Jesus uses an Old Testament prophetic image. You'll find this same language in Isaiah 13, 21, Jeremiah 6, 22. And all Jesus is saying here is this is just the beginning of something so much. And I cannot personally relate to this, but ladies, I guess the image is early in labor, if you are about to deliver, the birth pains begin, and they're there, and they're noticeable, and they're significant, but they're nothing like what you're going to endure before it's over. Is that fair to say? those of you who have experienced that. All right, that's fair. And that's the image. He's saying this is just the beginning. This is the mild stuff before we get to the really severe stuff that's going to come later. So he continues. Verses 9 through 13. Then, okay, so as it continues, they will deliver you. He's talking to the disciples. They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Okay, so now Jesus is, again, talking to his disciples, and he speaks of what's going to begin to happen after the beginning of birth pains, after these first signs. And again, I think it's reasonable. He's saying you. We know where he is. He's on the Mount of Olives. It's his disciples who've come to him privately and asked the question. So that's who he's talking to. So it's reasonable to say the you that he's addressing are the 12. Okay? They will take you to tribulation and so forth. And we know that the predictions that Jesus is making here prophetically about martyrdom and persecution of these guys, did that happen? Yes, it unfolds just as Jesus said it's going to. So we know that happened. We see the persecution in the book of Acts. And then in early church history, we have, I think, dependable accounts handed down from the early church to early history of how the apostles met their deaths.
Didn't they try to boil John in oil several times before they put him on the Isle of Patmos because he wouldn't cook?
Well, we've got lots of different stories of them. Eusebius, our historian, our early historian, if you don't know who Eusebius is, he's important, just like Josephus is important for our study of the Bible in those times, because he is going to give us really the first 300 years of church history. Okay? He's writing in the 4th century, but he's still really close to the sources. I mean, relatively speaking, he's really close. So he's given us a lot of this early history. And we know about the persecution that happened under Nero, 64 to 68 AD. And here's a quote from Eusebius. Thus Nero, publicly announcing himself the chief enemy of God, was led on his fury to slaughter the apostles. Paul is therefore said to have been beheaded in Rome, Peter to have been crucified under him, and this account is confirmed by the fact that the names of Peter and Paul still remain in the cemeteries of that city even to this day. And he gives other descriptions about James and others and how they died. So we know that what Jesus is saying here about the more severe stuff that he's telling his disciples is going to come, it came. It eventually did come. We know that during the Neronian persecutions and even the persecutions after that what Jesus says here about many falling away, many betraying one another, it's exactly what happened. As you would imagine, under persecution, there were Christians who apostatized. There were Christians who turned in their neighbors. You can imagine the fear of being tortured or being put to death, what that would do to people. And so all of these things we know actually did happen. Okay? Let's go on. Verse 14. And this gospel, this good news of the kingdom, will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, this is an interesting verse. But what's our number one rule as we're trying to study our Bible and interpret it well? Context. Context. There's a lot of verses within the Olivet Discourse. If you take them out of context, you might end up applying them to the wrong thing. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. And that's a challenge for all of us. But here it talks about the gospel going out, being proclaimed to the, quote, whole world. Then the end will come. Now, what, again, like I said, the challenge is the what and the when. What exactly is this referring to? I think it's possible, and again, we can debate this, that in this context, that when Jesus talks about the whole world, he is talking about their whole world. He's talking about the known world to his disciples was where? This Mediterranean larger area. This was their world, right? Their ministry had been confined to where? Judea, Galilee, little small part. Jesus is referring to this good news of the kingdom going out to all the world that they knew. And it's important to understand that in context. And we have more than just context. We also have the way Paul talked about this in the book of Colossians. So we can kind of put these things together. Notice how Paul talks about this to the Colossians. He says, we always thank God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, when we pray for you, since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love that you have for all the saints, because of the hope laid up for you in heaven. Of this you have heard much in the word of the truth, the gospel, which has come to you, and indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing. And then we skip to verse 23. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Isn't that interesting? So Paul kind of uses the same language that this even in his time, as he has been on these missionary journeys and the gospel is moving out, like we've been in the book of Romans, it's even got all the way to Rome, and he didn't even take it there. So he can talk about this gospel in his own time going to the whole world. Are you following me? So Jesus may be using that expression in the same way. This gospel is going to go to the whole world, guys, as you know it. It's going to go out from this location here, just in Israel, and it's going to go out to everywhere that you know. Then the end will come. So that begs the question, what end? Then the end will come. Well, if we keep it in context, I think he's still talking about the destruction of the temple. The end of this tribulation time that he's been talking about, the birth pangs and then it getting more severe, then the end, right? When it cataclysmically, the judgment comes that we know did come. I think that is what verse 14 is referring to, still attached to everything that it came before it. Any questions about that? That one's a little trickier one, I think. Yeah, John.
So you're saying that their whole world and our whole world are two different worlds.
In one way, yes.
But theirs is what they knew,
Yeah.
and we have become so globalized because of the progress of history that we can't take our whole world and put it back in and make it terrible.
And that's one of the challenges that you have to be on guard, is not to read back into the Bible a meaning of the same word, but that was being used very differently in one time period versus maybe how we use it. It's easy to do. We see the word world, and we have our understanding of what that means, right? It's this big globe hurtling through space, the world. That was not how they were using that same word. Yeah, so I think you do have to be aware of that. And in the context, it makes more sense of what we know also that unfolded, that this is what Jesus is meaning, the same way that Paul was using the word and the expression in Colossians. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
What you said in relation to that, in my footnotes it says, or in all the inhabited earth.
All the inhabited earth. Okay. Okay. I mean, I don't know if I'd put it that way, but that they knew of, that they were aware of. Yeah.
So the world is not the entire globe.
I
It
don't-
is just
I think in verse 14, in this context, right, I think it's talking about the Roman world and its hinterlands that they were aware of, that was their world, which would have been the inhabited world that they knew. I think that's what it's referring to here. When the good news of the kingdom goes out. And again, we might debate that more vigorously or push back on it, but yet you also have Paul using that same language in his own day. And the question is, well, Paul, are you wrong? There's a whole lot of world that you don't know about.
I get from what Paul is saying in Colossians,
Right.
I think I get that he is reaching for more knowledge, more understanding of that world that nobody else knows about. Because I've been fascinated for a long time with Paul. What happened as he sat at the feet of the resurrected Jesus? Those 3 years in the Arabian desert.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what did the Lord share with him? That maybe he didn't have time to share it all. He was so full.
I don't know. Well, again, this is, again, we're keeping an open hand with these things. I'm up here talking, so I'm teaching, but certainly there are others who see it differently. Remember what I said at the beginning? It depends on what you see these whole events thinking about. If you think that this whole discourse is about the parousia, the second coming, then this means something different. Okay, so that general approach that you take to the whole sermon determines, when you get into the weeds of particular verses, maybe how you understand those things. All right. Well, let's just keep going, see if we can hold it together. Yeah, Kersey.
So that was back in Colossians,
Mhm.
the previous one. Okay, so what do you do about proclaimed in all creation under heaven?
Mm-hmm. I think it's the same way of saying the whole world. Yeah, just a different way of saying it, but the same idea.
But then the world being the globe, like every continent.
I think, no, I would say what Paul's saying is the world that he is aware of, it has gone out everywhere that he knows of, which was their world.
If you break down that sentence, which has been, which means past tense,
Mm-hmm.
which to me would make believe that he's talking about the known world to him at that time.
Sure, yeah, and that makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Right.
That makes perfect sense. Because we know that there was a whole lot more world to be discovered and for the gospel to go to. And that's been happening ever since, as people discovered it. But this was Paul's world. This is where he was. All right, let's keep going and see if we get totally derailed or this starts making a lot more sense. One or the other. All right. So we go on to verse 15. And Jesus is continuing. Okay, so now here's some more stuff to come. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Okay. Now, you've seen abomination of desolation. We've been introduced to that, right? Back in Daniel. And Jesus even references as the prophet Daniel spoke about. So we know that in the context of Daniel, that abomination of desolation that came and was going to desecrate the temple, that now, again, is in our past, was actually in Jesus' past too. Who was that? Remember? Antiochus, right. Antiochus, the self-proclaimed illustrious one, who came in and did those horrible things, and then there was a revolt and all this type of thing. So Jesus is saying when you see this abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, and so that you're first struck like, well, wait a minute, that already happened. So what is Jesus doing here? Well, again, remember we talked about types. Jesus appears to be pointing towards a type, someone else who's going to come and do a similar thing that that guy did. Does it make sense? So he's going back to Daniel, and he's saying, when you see that thing happening again in the holy place, and it's interesting because Matthew adds, let the reader understand. Understand what? What do you think? We have John.
He's doing the same thing that you have been doing for us the last weeks. He says, let the reader understand, he's reminding them. You've been taught this before. He's reminding them what they already should know.
Yes.
Is that Daniel's teaching?
Yes, and I think that's right. I think Jesus is saying, when Matthew says, let the reader understand, he's pointing us back to Daniel. He's saying, you are familiar with Daniel, right? What Jesus is saying here. And that he's going to be standing in the holy place. Here in Mark and Luke, we see a little bit different wording. In Mark, but when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, well, in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee the mountains. In Luke, it's different. Luke 21:20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know its desolation has come near. Luke's the only one that words it that way. But yet those harmonize together perfectly, don't they? Because that's what's going to happen. The desolation, the abomination, the surrounding by armies, all of that's one big event that's going to happen. So again, our Gospels writers often have different words, even in the mouth of Jesus, but they completely harmonize. Jesus is saying the same thing in each account. And I hope that doesn't bother you too much. It would be, like, you retelling the stories that you saw or heard, and then someone else doing it, and you essentially say the same thing. You might use some different words, or you might emphasize a different part of it, but it's all true, right? Because it all harmonizes together. Nothing's contradicting itself. So our gospel writers do the same thing. So I don't want you to be bothered by that. I think that's one of the most remarkable things about the Gospels, is how they are very unique, and they include different details, but they fit together perfectly. Matthew and Mark's commentary has that let the reader understand of interest here, so that we know what Jesus is doing with Daniel, and that's important. And Jesus says that the disciples will see this abomination. The disciples will see this desolation. Now again, remember, he's talking to his disciples. He's not talking to us. Or another crowd. He's talking to the 12 on the Mount of Olives as they've come to him privately. He said, you're going to see this. Okay, so keep that in mind. You're going to see these things. Now, another question then from these verses, is what is this abomination of desolation? What is it? What is the actual event that Jesus might be referring to when he talks about, when you see this thing happen, it's time to get out of Dodge, right? You run. Don't look back. Get out of there when you see this happen. There's been some suggestions, I guess, of people who've thought about this, of what might that be. Some suggest that maybe Jesus is referring to a desolation, even his own crucifixion. That maybe he's talking about this event that's getting ready to happen. It is the desecration. I don't think many people buy that one, but it's one that's been suggested. One where maybe it's the reference to a Jewish rebellion where zealots took over in 67, just a few short years before the destruction. They took over Jerusalem. They particularly took over the temple and fortified it and kind of made it their militaristic headquarters. And they did all kinds of things in it, including murdering people, all kinds of abominable acts, again, that you can read about in Josephus and we know from history, that maybe this is a reference to that. When you see this happening, when you see this rebellion begin, when you see these zealots come and begin to create all of this unrest and they're killing people and they're taking over the temple, it's time to leave. When you see that abomination of desolation, it's about here. It could be that. Or is it a reference to when Rome actually comes in and soldiers begin to put up images of the emperor right on the temple ground and desecrate it? That one would seem like, well, it's too late to run now. It's too late to flee, if that's it.
The last two actually happened at the same time, because during Nero's dust-up in Rome, they actually paused the sacking of Jerusalem for a couple of years so they could go back and handle business in the homeland.
Yeah.
And during that time, the Zealots moved in, and then they started fighting other Jewish groups
Mm-hmm.
in the temple grounds.
Yes.
Some in the inner courts, some in the outer courts. It was a mess. And then the Romans came back and just sort of squared it all in their view.
Right. So is Jesus talking about, let's just say, when all that mess begins to start, you know the end's close
It makes sense.
and it's time to flee?
Because
Yeah.
understanding the timeline of Scripture. Anyway, at the time Jesus was talking to them, even if they were in the flesh,
Mm-hmm.
Israel still had a chance to accept her Messiah, accept the kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, remember all of Jesus' activity during this week as well. Remember Jesus' lament over Jerusalem, right? Place that kills the prophets and they won't repent. And then his just excoriating pronouncements on the religious leaders. And it's just, it's just one message of judgment after another coming from Jesus until his crucifixion. And that's what this is about as well. The judgment that is coming on Israel. And it's coming in a most terrible way, like what happened with Assyria, like what happened with Babylon. It's coming like that again. It's coming back around. It's cyclical. All right, let's continue. We'll run out of time. Verse 21, for then there will be a great tribulation. Now again, he's talking about this time period. Keep it in context. Such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Okay, that's some pretty strong language. So, does this fit what Jesus so far has been describing, or somehow have we fast forwarded to something else? That's kind of the interpretive question. And here's what we do know. The Jewish-Roman wars that happened, they happened in three different phases, you might say, from 66 to 135. And it's of this first Jewish war from 66 to 73 that Jesus really seems to be referring to that is coming, okay? Around 40 years from when he ascends back to heaven. And I think you can reasonably say from what we know about what came to be, what Rome came in and did, there had never been anything like it, not the Assyrians, not the Babylonians. There has never been anything since then that has happened on that soil that was as severe and murderous and awful. Again, go to Josephus. You can read some real gory details.
Josephus estimates 1.1 million.
1.1 million people and just the cruelty of the whole thing. There hasn't been anything else like that. Because I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. There's never been something as severe as that's happened there in Jerusalem. 70 AD. Well, in that whole time period, that's 66 to 73. It ends, you've heard of Masada. That first Jewish war ends with the capturing of that fortress Masada, where the last of the zealots held out until they just couldn't. They all committed suicide. And that's kind of how that first war ended. But the horrors of the siege of Jerusalem are well documented. And how many people died and the brutality of it all and just the things that happened do seem to be kind of unparalleled. If anything came before or after.
Today is even seeing that and knowing that it happened, and now seeing the way things are shaping up in the world, we see a possibility for something like that to happen again.
Well, things do kind of do this. Verse 22. And if those days, okay, these awful days that he's been describing, had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. In other words, God's still in control of this. And if God hadn't stopped it, what Jesus seems to be saying is our people would have been completely exterminated. They would have been all just exterminated if God had not cut this short, if he hadn't stopped it. And so again, there's that promise, not total destruction. God will stop it. Then we go on, verses 23 through 26. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise, perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. This is interesting, isn't it? So Jesus is telling his disciples, in the future, you need to be careful of false claims of those claiming to be the Messiah. And he's warning about the false claims that did arise by zealots and fanatics, we'll call them, claiming to be Messiah in the sense of they were the ones that were going to actually get rid of the Romans. Come follow me. That never ended well. But they were always popping up. And so if they pop up in the wilderness, don't go out there and follow them. If they come out, if they say that the Messiah is hiding in a secret place and he's about to make his appearance, don't fall for it. Now, I think Jesus is talking about a time period after he's gone. He's done, I mean, the crucifixion happens, his resurrection, he ascends back to heaven. And I think he's referring to, like, you're going to be looking for my return, okay? But you're going to hear about these Christs, these Messiahs, and it's going to always be linked to getting rid of the Romans. Don't go after that. Don't follow that, because that isn't legit. And I think he's saying that because of what he says next. In verse 27, I think we get our first reference to his second coming. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. You're going to hear all of these dubious, cryptic, strange things about Messiahs out here, the guys out here. He's our hope. All that. He says, look, when the Son of Man does return, what's it going to be like? Lightning that comes from the east and shines as far as the west. It's going to be unmistakable. You're not going to have to wonder if it's me. It's going to be clear. It's me. But if you hear these other things, just know that's not me. Don't go after that. Don't think that that's me. Because when I come, it's going to be so clear and dramatic. And here is where we get that word parousia. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. That is the Greek word parousia. It means coming, arrival. So I think Jesus is now, in the context of talking about this judgment that's coming, that we know did happen by the Romans in 70 AD, he's also saying, don't confuse anything that's happening there, especially claims of people who say they're Messiah, with my return, because that's going to be different. so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And here he is again referring back to Daniel in that vision in chapter 7. I'll put it up there for you to remind you of it, of the Son of Man, right? He came to the Ancient of Days, presented before him this one like a son of man. All right? And then the next verse is maybe even a little stranger, right? He gives them sort of this proverbial statement. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather.
Nobody can find where he got it. Quotes have never been found, but it's obviously been used.
It seems like a proverbial statement that they would have been familiar with, that Jesus inserts there, referring again to the coming judgment on Israel at the hands of Rome. That you'll know one from the other. You'll know as vultures circle and heap up on a carcass. You're going to know which is which. You'll understand that. So don't confuse this coming judgment with Christ's return that I believe he is referencing there in verse 27. All right, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, have we encountered this? We've encountered this language, right? Isaiah. Did I put them up there? Oh, they're there. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Joel, the day of the Lord. We've seen this prophetic language and imagery already used in relationship to judgment. In Isaiah, it's in reference to judgment on Babylon. In Ezekiel, it's a reference to judgment on Egypt. In Joel, it's a reference to the day of the Lord, which in that context is talking about a plague of locusts. But they all have in common that this is God's judgment. And this is the type of hyperbolic language that you find in the prophets. Because the judgments did come. Judgment came on Babylon, judgment came on Israel, came on Judah, came on Egypt. All these judgments came, but the cosmos didn't stop working. Like the sun didn't literally go out. All the stars didn't literally fall from heaven. But this language is always associated with this cosmic divine judgment that comes. And it's just prophetic language. Does that make sense? Okay? So here you see Jesus using this same kind of language in the context of pronouncing prophetically judgment on Jerusalem, on the destruction of the temple. And for his Jewish audience, his disciples, this would make perfect sense. That he's speaking in this kind of language, because they would have immediately gone, oh my gosh, that's what Isaiah said. that's the language of Joel. That's the language of Ezekiel. This is going to be bad, right? This is going to be bad. I think that's really more of what you get out of that language in this context, and Jesus talking about this event that was going to happen. All right, verses 30 and 31. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes in the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angel with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. And here again we see similarity to Zechariah, where Zechariah 12:10, he talked about they will look on him who they pierced, and they will mourn. And in Zechariah 2:6, up, up, flee from the land of the north, declares the Lord, for I have spread you abroad to the four winds of the heavens. So the question here is, what is the sign of the Son of Man that will appear in heaven coupled with this loud trumpet? I mean, that's the good question to ask. It has a very militaristic feel, doesn't it? And some people see that Jesus has now fully transitioned to talking about the parousia, about his second coming, right? And some people see this as his coming. They see an allusion to the rapture here, gathering the elect and that type of thing. Some people see this as harmonize it with what Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 4 about the rapture. And we'll get to Thessalonians next time. I think that's one way some people have seen this. Another way folks have seen it is that Jesus is still in the context of talking about what's going to happen to Jerusalem. And he is still referring to Daniel. He's still referring to the vision in chapter 7. But it's not the image of the Son of Man coming, down on the clouds. It's the vision, like in Daniel, that you're looking up and you're seeing him there, receiving a kingdom and power and glory and reigning. And again, the trumpet sound and the sign could almost be envisioned like an army that is going out, bearing a standard and a trumpet call and this type of thing. The angels are going, right, to gather the elect and this type of thing. So some people see that this isn't, again, we're not to a reference to his second coming yet. It's a reference to his power, his authority, his judgment, and that is involved in what's going to happen. Okay? So those are two ways that we've seen it. Remember I told you one of the trickiest things about the Olivet Discourse, most people think he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and he's talking about his second coming. It gets a little tricky sometimes. We're saying, well, where is he talking about what? And that becomes some of the challenge. Make sense? Y'all look thoroughly confused. All right. We'll keep going. When we get to verse 32, then we get to the fig tree illustration. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near. Some translations say it is near, at the very gates. So now Jesus transitions into this image, this metaphor about what's going to come. And again, that he is here, there really is no pronoun in the Greek there. So I think it's really a reference to the event, the thing that's going to happen. I think it is probably a better way to see that. But Jesus uses this, and the way it works here, it would seem, is that the fig tree, as you see its buds, you see its leaves, it's an indication of the things that are coming, and summer is when it comes. Okay? So the leaves and the budding are all about the signs he's been talking about. The summer is when the hammer falls. Okay? So that's the illustration. So he's saying to his disciples, you're gonna see, just like you can look at a fig tree and you know what season it is and where it's going, you're gonna be able to see where this is going, is what he's telling his disciples. Now here's where I think the evidence comes in that he's still talking about the destruction of the temple. Even in that whole section just before about the Son of Man and the clouds, the trumpet, and all of that. Here's where I think that makes more sense. When you get here and it says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Who's Jesus talking to? His disciples. Okay? Privately, on the Mount of Olives. This is not the Sermon on the Mount where he's talking to thousands of people. And he wasn't talking to us. He was talking to his disciples. We're reading about it, but he was talking to his disciples. So the most natural way to take this is he's talking to them is to say, you guys, this generation, your contemporaries. This is who I'm talking to. That seems to be the most natural way to take that. And if we understand that everything Jesus has been talking about up to this point is about the coming judgment on Israel, the Roman siege of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because their generation did see those things. It happened. Yeah. Still answering the first question. Still answering the first question, then it makes perfect sense to just see that, well, he's talking about the disciples and their generation. There have been some other interpretations, but you're forced into a different interpretation if you think Jesus has been talking about the second coming. If you think that everything we've been reading up to this point is about the second coming, then now what does he mean by this generation won't pass away till all these things take place? That doesn't seem to make sense because he hasn't come. And that generation is long gone, right? So you'd have to come up with a different understanding of what he means by that. Some people have said, well, what Jesus meant there is he's using that word that we say generations, but he's talking about a people group. He's saying, you, Jewish people, my disciples, you Jews, you will not pass away until all these things have happened. Have you heard that one? Yeah, I have too. Yeah, so if you think Jesus has been talking about the second coming, then sometimes that's sort of a creative way to interpret this about the generations to make it fit, to make it make sense. I think personally there's a problem with that because now the whole point of what Jesus is saying has a temporal meaning to it, right? These things are going to happen, and these things are going to happen, these things are going to happen. And even when he says this generation won't pass away until these things happen, it's all temporal. But now if you just make it into the Jews won't become extinct, now it just almost doesn't even make sense because now you're not even talking about the same thing. It's apples and oranges, so to speak. So again, it depends on what you think Jesus is still continuing to talk about. Has he shifted to talking about the second coming, or is he still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem? All right, I gotta hurry, man. All right. Verse 36. What's that? I'm sorry. He's been warning them because he's telling them, flee. That's what he said. Flee. When you see these things happening, flee. Destruction's coming. Yeah, John.
Remember in chapter 23, he gives the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees. And when he's done giving those woes, he said, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation.
Mm-hmm.
So he already shows us how he uses that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point.
So if we come up with a creative way to use it a different way, then we're violating the way that it's used here.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point.
Like echo the woes and the bowls, the 7 bowls that we poured out. And that's a repetitive phrase in Revelation.
Okay.
Woe to.
Well, we're going to get to Revelation. We're going to get there, I promise. Let me get through this, though. But concerning, here, the next verse, verse 36, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, for not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. Okay, I think here is where we transition in verse 36, because there's a distinct contrast now. It's like, but now, concerning that day. Well, which day? Well, the second part of their question, way back in verse 3. The second part of their question. When will be your coming and the end of the age? So now I think he transitions. He said, this generation is not going to pass away until all these things happen. Okay, but now that day, notice what he says, I can't tell you about that day. Nobody knows about that day. The angels don't know. Not even the Son knows. And you certainly aren't going to know. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Notice how specific he was in the first question.
Mm-hmm.
He gives you all kind of detail.
Yeah.
When he gets to the second question, he just says, well, it's a little vague here.
Well, he even says, and one of the great mysteries is even the Son does not know. We know Jesus was fully divine. We know he's also fully human. There's a mystery there of what Jesus says. Only the Father knows, and he's not revealed that to anyone. Okay, I'll just take it as his word, that that's the case. And what Jesus is going to go on and emphasize now is not the details of look for the signs, like he just did with all of this other stuff. He's going to go on and say, you're not going to know, just be ready. That's going to be the message, okay? So we'll go on. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So Jesus' return will be unexpected. It'll be sudden. It'll be cataclysmic, just like the flood was. He goes on. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, one will be left. Again, suddenness. They're going to be going, he's saying people are going to be going about their daily routines, and then suddenly this is going to happen. And it's going to catch people off guard. Some people see a reference to rapture here. One will be taken, right? You've heard that probably. One will be taken, one will be left. One will be taken, one will be left. You can also see this in context, I think, as judgment. Because everything Jesus is saying here, just kind of follow me. Everything he's saying in this section is about the suddenness, the unexpectedness of the judgment that's coming at his return. So I think it's really better to see there's 2 men. One is taken to judgment. The other is spared. One woman is taken to judgment, and the other one is spared when he returns. I think again, in context and what Jesus is doing here, that's a better way to understand that, of what he's saying is going to happen. Okay? Let's continue. I got to go fast. Therefore, stay awake. Stay awake in this preparedness. For you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Man, Jesus is driving home the same point, just in different ways, right? Be prepared, be alert, be ready. You don't know when this is going to happen, but when it happens, it's too late. The judgment is falling on people. 1 Thessalonians 5 talks about him coming like a thief in the night. 2 Peter 3, 8 through 10, I won't read these for you, also talk about him coming like a thief in the night. Okay? So again, do you ever expect a thief? You're really not thinking about it. Anybody been robbed, your house broken into? Yeah, me too, when I was a kid. Nobody was expecting that. You walk in, you've been out, you walk in and you look around, you go, oh my gosh, a thief came. You weren't thinking that day a thief was going to break into your house that night. It was the last thing on your mind. So Jesus is saying that the world is going to get surprised. You, my disciples, don't be surprised. Be alert, be living the right way, be attentive to what I'm telling you. Then he goes on and gives some more examples. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom the master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. So Jesus begins to tell these parables. You know, if you're a faithful servant, and I've put you in charge, a servant's been put in charge, because, when the master went away back in these days on a long-distance journey, it wasn't an exact science. They had no idea on what day or hour that he's going to return. Just didn't know. But this is a wise and good servant who's doing what they're supposed to be doing, is going to be rewarded when the master suddenly returns. But on contrast, you have this wicked servant. Says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards. The master of the servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at that hour he does not know, and he will cut him in pieces and put him in with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. There's your gentle Jesus. No, really, that's Jesus. How severe this judgment's going to be on unbelievers who are not prepared. Cut him to pieces, put him with the hypocrites. I'm going to skip. This is Mark's ending, Luke's ending. They're very similar, but different, but pretty much the same. Just kind of skip here to the takeaways. Because that's how it ends. Now, actually, Jesus goes on into chapter 25 and tells some parables that basically emphasize the same point, right? The 10 virgins, the talents, preparedness, alertness, good stewardship, and then that parable about the final or not parable, but the lesson about the final judgment, the sheep and the goats. That's part of Matthew's version of that whole sermon as well, and you can read those. But he's just emphasizing the same thing in different parables in different ways. The takeaways here, certainly we have some interpretive challenges. Again, Jesus talking about one event or two events. If he's talking about two events, then, when does he move from the abomination of desolation to the parousia? When exactly does that happen? Again, you'll always see discussion about how to understand this generation in verse 34. That's always going to be kind of a discussion. And then, again, as we move along, how to harmonize the prophets, how to harmonize the book of Revelation. We get there with his Olivet Discourse. And we'll be talking more about that as well. But some good takeaways from us, I think, is that especially for the disciples, Jesus was telling them, you got to be ready. Some bad stuff is going down here, and you've got to be ready. And we got to appreciate the position the disciples were in. Can you imagine living in their context as they spread the gospel? The hostile world that they went into, this Roman world, this political turmoil, even within their own people, these zealots who were just awful. All of them, they're going to die martyrs' deaths. So think about what Jesus is trying to warn them of and help them to understand. And then for us on this side of what Jesus is talking about, it's just about living expectantly. It's about living every day knowing that when Jesus returns, it is going to be sudden and unexpected for the whole world, especially Jesus is emphasizing for the unbelieving world who are going to receive judgment. But for us who believe, it might be a surprise, but it shouldn't be unexpected. Right? It's like, oh, we knew he was coming. We knew he was coming. And if that doesn't give us an urgency for the gospel, I'm not sure what can. Because when you read about the awfulness of the judgment that's coming on unbelievers, I hope it gives the church an urgency to say, man, people need the gospel. You know what's more important than me understanding all this prophecy? It's sharing the gospel. It's so much more important that a person know Jesus Christ as their Savior and know that they're ready than to understand every nuance of all this prophecy. Does that make sense? I mean, that's got to be our takeaway from the things that Jesus is saying here. Okay. Any questions? There should be none. No, there probably are 1,000 questions because there's so many. But you've been very gracious to just let me talk. But keep digging, because what I find is I've heard so many different things growing up and in the churches I've been in and sermons I've heard and books I've read. I've heard so many different things. I find that the most fruitful study for me, though, is just getting alone with God, with the Word, and just trying to be a good student of the Bible itself and let it interpret itself. Knowing some history, being aware of a Josephus, being aware of it's helpful. It's helpful. It can bring some light But there's nothing better than not camping yourself after a certain person or a certain scheme or whatever, but just sitting down with the Bible and letting it speak to you as you read it and get more and more and more familiar with it. I think it begins to make more and more sense to you as you do that. And God reveals it to you. I believe that. Okay? I'm way over time, so let me pray. Father, thank you for your word, and thank you for helping us to understand it. And Lord, I acknowledge there are places where I'm probably getting it wrong. So Lord, just continue to teach me and help me to dig deeper, to pray harder, to understand, to seek you, and be patient with that. And again, help us to be patient with one another. But Lord, remind us that we do know what's most important, God. You are reigning and ruling, and you're coming. And you've given us a mission to preach the gospel, to advance the gospel, to take it to the nations, to love each other, to care for each other, to encourage each other in love, and to spur each other onto good works. And Lord, to know at your coming that we are not ashamed, Lord, because we're living for you. So you help us to be faithful in all things.